Bantam Audio Publishing presents a Doubleday production of Foundation by Isaac Asimov. According to the Encyclopedia Galactica, Hari Seldon was born in the 11,988th year of the Galactic Era and died in 12,069. Undoubtedly, his greatest contributions were in the field of psychohistory. He made of it a profound statistical science. The best existing authority we have on the details of his life is the biography by Gail Dornick. Dornick, as a young man, met Seldon on the planet Trantor 2 years before the great mathematician's death. Gail Dornick was just a country boy who had never seen Trantor before. That is, not in real life. He had seen it many times on the hypervideo, and occasionally in tremendous three-dimensional newscasts covering an imperial coronation or the opening of a galactic council. Even though he had lived all his life on the world of Synnax, which circled a star at the edges of the blue drift, he was not cut off from civilization, you see. At that time, no place in the galaxy was. There were nearly 25 million inhabited planets in the galaxy then, and not one but owed allegiance to the empire whose seat was on Trantor. It was the last half-century in which that could be said. To Gail, this trip was the undoubted climax of his young scholarly life. He had been in space before, so that the trip, as a voyage and nothing more, meant little to him, aside from the ship, large and glistening, the cool production of 12,000 years of imperial progress, and an invitation from the great Harry Seldon to come to Trantor and join the vast and somewhat mysterious Seldon project. Gail was waiting for the first sight of Trantor. He haunted the viewing room. The steel shutter lids were rolled back at announced times, and he was always there, watching the hard brilliance of the stars, enjoying the incredible hazy swarm of a star cluster, like a giant conglomeration of fireflies caught in mid-motion and stilled forever. The first sight of Trantor's sun was that of a hard, white speck, recognizable only because it was pointed out by the ship's guide. The stars were thick here, near the galactic center. An officer came through and said that the view room would be closed for the remainder of the trip as they prepared to land. Gail followed after, clutching at the sleeves of the white uniform with the spaceship and sun of the Empire on it. "Would it be possible for me to stay?" he asked. "I would like to see Trantor from space." The officer smiled and politely denied Gail's request. He explained that since they were spinning down Sunside, Gail risked being blinded, burnt, and radiation-scarred all at the same time. Gail started to walk away. The officer called after him, "Why don't you take a space tour once you hit Trantor, kid? They're cheap." It was childish to feel disappointed, but there was a lump in Gail's throat. He had never seen Trantor spread out in all its incredibility, as large as life, and he hadn't expected to wait any longer. The ship landed in a medley of noises. Gail felt a slight jar that indicated the ship no longer had an independent motion of its own. Ship's gravity had been giving way to planetary gravity for hours. Thousands of passengers had been sitting patiently in the debarkation rooms, which swung easily on yielding force fields to accommodate the changing direction of the gravitational forces. Now the passengers were crawling down curving ramps to the large, yawning locks. Gail's baggage was minor. He stood at a desk as it was quickly and expertly taken apart and put together again. His visa was inspected and stamped. He himself paid no attention. The debarkation building was tremendous. The roof was almost lost in the heights. Gail could see no opposite wall, just men and desks and converging floor till it faded out in haze. The man at the desk, sounding annoyed, urged Gail to move on. He directed him toward glowing twists of air that were suspended high in nothingness, and read, "Taxis, taxis to all points." A figure detached itself from anonymity and stopped at the desk as Gail left. The man at the desk looked up and nodded briefly. The figure nodded in return and followed the young immigrant. He was in time to hear Gail's destination. Gail asked the supervisor for directions to a good hotel. The supervisor touched a button. A thin line of light formed along the floor, twisting among others, which brightened and dimmed in different colors and shades. A ticket was shoved into Gail's hand. It glowed faintly. "Follow the light," said the supervisor. "The ticket will keep glowing as long as you're pointed in the right direction." Gail began walking. There were thousands of people creeping across the vast floor, following their individual trails of light, sifting and straining themselves through intersection points to arrive at their respective destinations. His own trail ended. A man in a glaring blue and yellow uniform, shining anew in unstainable plastotextile, reached for his 2 bags. "Direct line to the Luxor," he said. The man who followed Gail heard that. He also watched Gail enter the blunt-nosed vehicle. The taxi lifted straight up. Gail stared out the curved transparent window. The vastness contracted, and the people became ants in random distribution. The scene contracted further and began to slide backward. There was a wall ahead. It began high in the air and extended out of sight. It was riddled with holes that were the mouths of tunnels. Gail's taxi moved toward one, then plunged into it. There was now only blackness, with nothing but the past flashing of a colored signal light to relieve the gloom. The air was full of a rushing sound. Gail leaned forward as the taxi decelerated, popped out of the tunnel, and descended to ground level once more. "The Luxor Hotel," said the driver unnecessarily. He helped Gail with his baggage, accepted a 10th credit tip with a businesslike air, picked up a waiting passenger, and was rising again. In all this, from the moment of debarkation, there had been no glimpse of sky. Trantor, from an entry in the Encyclopedia Galactica. As the center of the imperial government for unbroken hundreds of generations, and located as it was toward the central regions of the galaxy, Trantor could scarcely help being the densest and richest clot of humanity the race had ever seen. Its urbanization had finally reached the ultimate. All the land surface of Trantor, 75 million square miles in extent, was a single city. The enormous population was devoted almost entirely to administrative necessities of the Galactic Empire, and found themselves all too few for the complexities of the task. It is to be remembered that this, under the uninspired leadership of the later emperors, was a considerable factor in the fall of the empire. Gail was not certain whether the sun shone or, for that matter, whether it was day or night. He was too ashamed to ask. Lingering a moment or two in the Luxor's main lobby, he asked the room clerk if there was a means of getting into the open air. The clerk sold him a ticket to an observation tower and directed him to a special elevator, which turned out to be one of the new sort, that ran by gravitic propulsion. Gail gasped his thanks as the elevator came to a halt, then stepped out upon an open terrace bathed in a white brilliance that hurt his eyes. He leaned over the shoulder-high railing and took in all the panorama. He could not see the ground. It was lost in the ever-increasing complexities of man-made structures. He could see no horizon other than that of metal against sky, stretching out to almost uniform grayness, and he knew it was so over all the land surface of the planet. There was no green to be seen, no life other than man. He sighed noisily and realized finally that he was on Trantor at last, on the planet which was the center of all the galaxy and the kernel of the human race. He saw none of its weaknesses. He saw no ships of food landing from agricultural worlds. He was not aware of a jugular vein delicately connecting the 40 billion of Trantor with the rest of the galaxy. He was conscious only of the mightiest deed of man, the complete and almost contemptuously final conquest of a world. He came away a little blank-eyed. A man who had been near him in the elevator was indicating a seat next to himself, and Gail took it. The man, smiling, introduced himself as Gerald. He asked Gail if this was his first time on Trantor and what he thought of it. Gail fumbled. "Glorious," he said. Then Gerald asked if he had come on vacation. Gail answered that while he'd always wanted to visit Trantor, he'd come primarily for a job, with Dr. Seldon's project at the university. "Raven Seldon?" asked Gerald. "Why, no," said Gail. "Harry Seldon, the psychohistorian." Gerald replied that Harry was the one he meant. "They call him Raven because he keeps predicting disaster," said Gerald. "Surely you must know. You're coming to work for him." Gail was annoyed. Excusing himself, he left for his room. Gerald waved his arm indifferently in farewell. In his room, Gail found a man waiting for him. For a moment he was too startled to put into words the inevitable, "What are you doing here?" The man rose. He was old and almost bald, and he walked with a limp, but his eyes were very bright and blue. "I am Harry Seldon," he said. According to the Encyclopedia Galactica, psychohistory is defined as the branch of mathematics which deals with the reactions of human conglomerates to fixed social and economic stimuli. Implicit in all these definitions is the assumption that the human conglomerate being dealt with is sufficiently large for valid statistical treatment. A further necessary assumption is that the human conglomerate itself be unaware of psychohistoric analysis in order that its reactions be truly random. The basis of all valid psychohistory lies in the development of the Seldon functions which exhibit properties congruent to social and economic forces. "Harry Seldon!" Gail stammered out a greeting, but Harry Seldon interrupted him. "You didn't think we were to meet before tomorrow," he said. "Ordinarily, we would not have. It is just that if we are to use your services, we must work quickly. It grows continually more difficult to obtain recruits." Gail did not understand. "You were talking to a man on the observation tower, were you not?" asked Seldon. And he told Gail that the man was an agent of the Commission of Public Safety, and that he had followed him from the spaceport. Then he asked Gail what Trantor meant to him. Everyone seemed to be asking Gail his opinion of Trantor. He felt incapable of response beyond the bare word, "glorious." "You say that without thinking," Seldon commented. Then he asked, "What of psychohistory?" Gail said he hadn't thought of applying it to the problem. "Before you are done with me, young man, you will learn to apply psychohistory to all problems as a matter of course. Observe." Seldon removed his calculator pad from the pouch at his belt. Its gray glossy finish was slightly worn by use. Seldon's nimble fingers, spotted now with age, played along the files and rows of buttons that filled the calculator's surface. Red symbols glowed out from the upper tier. "That," he said, "represents the condition of the Empire at present. Add to this the known probability of imperial assassination, vice-regal revolt, the contemporary recurrence of periods of economic depression, the declining rate of planetary explorations. As each item was mentioned, new symbols sprang to life at his touch and melted into the basic function which expanded and changed. Finally Seldon stopped. This is Trantor 3 centuries from now. How do you interpret that, eh? He put his head to one side and waited. Gail could not believe it. There was only one interpretation possible. Total destruction. But that was inconceivable. Trantor. Seldon was filled with the intense excitement of one whose body only had grown old. Now he urged Gail to put into words what he had seen, to forget the symbolism. As Trantor becomes more specialized, observed Gail, it becomes more vulnerable, less able to defend itself. Further, as it becomes more and more the administrative center of the empire, it becomes a greater prize, as Seldon interrupted him abruptly, challenging him to determine the numerical probability of total destruction within 3 centuries. Gail was not offered the calculator pad. Rather, it was held a foot from his eyes. Calculating furiously in his mind, he felt his forehead grow slick with sweat. 85% was the figure he came up with. Not bad, said Seldon, thrusting out a lower lip, but not good. The actual figure is 92.5%. Gail wondered why he had not read about this in any of the journals. Seldon informed him that these figures were unprintable, lest the Imperium expose its shakiness. This is a very simple demonstration in psychohistory, he concluded, but some of our results have leaked out to the aristocracy. Was Seldon in danger? Gail wondered. Oh, yes, said Seldon. There is a probability of 1.7% that I will be executed. But that, of course, will not stop the project. Gail was awakened the next morning by a muted buzzer. He answered it, and the voice of the desk clerk, quiet, polite, and deprecating as it might be, informed him that he was under detention at the orders of the Commissioner of Public Safety. Gail sprang to the door and found it would no longer open. He could only dress and wait. They came for him and took him elsewhere, but it was still detention. They asked him questions most politely. It was all very civilized. Over and over again he gave details about his background, and over again they returned to the question of his joining the Seldon project. How had he heard of it? He answered that he did not know. He had no secret instructions. He was a scholar and a mathematician. He had no interest in politics. Finally, the gentle inquisitor asked when he thought Trantor would be destroyed. Gail faltered, and the inquisitor asked if anyone else he knew had told him of such destruction or set a date. Again, Gail hesitated. The inquisitor informed him that he had been followed. Men of the commission had been at the airport, on the observation tower, and, of course, they had been able to overhear Gail's conversation with Harry Seldon. Then you know, said Gail. He is of the opinion that Trantor will be destroyed within 3 centuries. The inquisitor asked if Seldon had proved this mathematically, and when Gail answered that he had, he was asked if he considered the mathematics to be valid. Gail replied that if Dr. Seldon vouched for it, it was valid. Then we will return, said the inquisitor. The trial had not lasted long. It was in its 3rd day, yet already Gail could no longer stretch his memory back far enough to remember the beginning. He himself had been little pecked at. The heavy guns were trained on Dr. Seldon. Harry Seldon, however, sat there unperturbed. To Gail, he was the one spot of stability remaining in the world, for the atmosphere was one of unrelieved hostility toward the defendants. 5 of the Commission of Public Safety sat behind the raised desk. They wore scarlet and gold uniforms and the shining, close-fitted plastic caps that were the sign of their judicial function. In the center was the Chief Commissioner, Ling Chen. Gail had never before seen so great a lord, and he watched him with fascination. The commissioner's advocate consulted his notes, and the examination continued, with Seldon still on the stand. "Let us take up a matter," he said, "which we have already discussed in some length. Would you repeat, Dr. Seldon, your thoughts concerning the future of Trantor?" Seldon repeated his prediction that Trantor would be in ruins within the next 3 centuries. The advocate suggested that Seldon's statement was a disloyal one. "Scientific truth," replied Seldon, "is beyond loyalty or disloyalty." The advocate next asked if Seldon were sure of this scientific truth, and when he answered that he was, Seldon was asked on what basis. "On the basis of the mathematics of psychohistory," he said. The advocate asked if he could prove that this mathematics was valid. Seldon said that he could, but only to another mathematician. "You have made your point, Dr. Seldon," he began. "Let me suggest to you, sir, that your prediction of disaster might be intended to destroy public confidence in the imperial government for purposes of your own." Seldon stated that this was not so. "Let me suggest," said the advocate, "that you intend to claim that a period of time preceding the so-called ruin of Trantor will be filled with unrest of various types." This, Seldon said, was correct. "And," said the advocate, "that by the mere prediction thereof you hope to bring it about, and to have then an army of 100,000 available." Seldon protested. According to his testimony, the count of 98,572 individuals in his project included women and children. "Investigation will show you," Seldon concluded, "that barely 10,000 of the men are of military age, and none of these has training in arms." The advocate then asked Dr. Seldon if he considered himself to be serving science. The psychohistorian answered that he did. "Then let us see how," said the advocate, and he proceeded to ask if the overall history of the human race could be changed. "Only with great difficulty," answered Seldon. "The psychohistoric trend of a planet full of people contains a huge inertia. To be changed, it must be met with something possessing a similar inertia. Either as many people must be concerned, or, if the number of people be relatively small, then enormous time for change must be allowed." "Am I to understand, then," said the advocate, "that Trantor need not be ruined if a good many people decide to act so that it will not?" Seldon said this was right, but further questioning revealed that his 100,000 people and their descendants were far too few, and 300 years too short a time to change the trend. "In other words," said the advocate, "your 100,000 people cannot prevent the destruction of Trantor no matter what they do." Seldon answered that this was, unfortunately, correct. "And," said the advocate, "your 100,000 are intended for no illegal purpose?" "Exactly," Seldon replied. The advocate smiled. "In that case," he said, "now attend, sir, most carefully, for we want a considered answer. What is the purpose of your 100,000? There was a rising buzz of conversation at that which swept the ranks of peers in the audience, and invaded even the row of commissioners. They swayed toward one another in their scarlet and gold, only the chief remaining uncorrupted. Harry Seldon stood unmoved. He waited for the babble to evaporate. Then he spoke. "To minimize the effects of that destruction," he said. The advocate demanded specifics. Seldon explained. "The coming destruction of Trantor is not an isolated event in the scheme of human development. It will be the climax of an intricate drama which was begun centuries ago, and which is accelerating in pace continuously. I refer, gentlemen, to the developing decline and fall of the Galactic Empire." The buzz now became a dull roar. The advocate, unheeded, began to yell in response, but stopped when cries of "treason" from the audience showed that the point had been made. Slowly the chief commissioner raised his gavel once and let it drop, and when the reverberation ceased, the gavel of the audience also did. The advocate took a deep breath. He reminded Seldon that the empire had stood for 12,000 years, and had behind it all the good wishes and love of a quadrillion human beings. "I am aware," said Seldon, "both of the present status and past history of the empire. My prediction, after all, is based on mathematics, not moral judgments." "Is it not obvious," asked the advocate, that the Empire is as strong as it had ever been? Seldon replied that the Empire appeared strong, but would not last forever. The Empire will vanish, he said firmly, and all its good with it, its accumulated knowledge, and its order will decay. Interstellar wars will be endless, interstellar trade will deteriorate, worlds will lose touch with the main body of the galaxy. A vast silence fell over the room. Psychohistory, said Seldon, can make statements concerning the succeeding Dark Ages. The Empire has indeed lasted 12,000 years. The Dark Ages to come will endure not 12, but 30,000 years. A second empire will arise, but between it and our civilization will be 1,000 generations of suffering humanity. We must fight this. The advocate looked down. Seldon continued. We cannot prevent the fall, he said, but it is possible to reduce the duration of anarchy to a single millennium if my group is allowed to act now. The advocate, after pausing to recollect himself, asked Seldon how he proposed to do this. By saving the knowledge of the race, Seldon replied. With the destruction of the Empire's social fabric, science will break into 1,000,000 pieces. Tiny facets of knowledge will be meaningless and useless by themselves, and bits of lore will not be passed on. Rather, they will be lost through the ages. But if we now prepare a giant summary of all knowledge, then it will never be lost. Coming generations will build on it and will not have to rediscover it for themselves. 1 millennium could do the work of 30,000. All the thousands of men in my project, with their wives and children, are devoting themselves to the preparation of an Encyclopedia Galactica. They will not complete it in their lifetimes, he said. I will not even live to see it fairly begun. But by the time Trantor falls, it will be complete, and copies will exist in every major library in the galaxy. The Chief Commissioner's gavel rose and fell. Harry Seldon left the stand and quietly took his seat next to Gail. He asked the younger mathematician how he liked the show. You stole it, said Gail. But what will happen now? The next day's hearings were entirely different. Hari Seldon and Gail Dornick were alone with the commission. Seldon complained that his lawyer was not present. A commissioner informed him that this was no longer a trial, but a discussion of the safety of the state. It was then that Ling Chen spoke. Chen told Seldon, "You have disturbed the peace in the Emperor's realm with events of 3 centuries' distance. Why concern oneself," he asked, "when none of the quadrillions living among the stars of the galaxy would be living then?" Seldon spoke of idealism, of mysticism, and the good of humanity. But mysticism did not interest Chen. "Can you tell me," he asked Seldon, "why I may not rid myself of you and of an uncomfortable and unnecessary 3-century future which I will never see by having you executed tonight?" Seldon warned that news of his interrupted trial and thwarted efforts to lighten disaster would convince the people that the future held no promise. Ambitious men will not wait, he said, and unscrupulous men will not hang back. By their every action they will hasten the decay of the worlds. Have me killed, and Trantor will fall not within 3 centuries, but within 50 years, and you yourself within a single year. Chen began to question Seldon on the practical aspects of preparing the encyclopedia. Need it be done on Trantor? Would not a less hurried planet have advantages, a place where his men might devote themselves entirely to their scholastic musings? Seldon replied that such advantages would be minor at best. But, Chen went on, such a world has been chosen, a world where you may work at leisure with your 100,000. The galaxy will know that you're fighting the fall. They will even be told you will prevent the fall. The alternative, said Chen, is death for yourself and as many of your followers as will seem necessary." And he gave Seldon 5 minutes to make his choice between death and exile. Seldon asked, "Which is the world chosen?" "Terminus," replied Chen, "a secluded, uninhabited planet at the edge of the galaxy." "I accept Exile," said Seldon. Gale's heart skipped a beat at the words. He was filled with joy, for who would not be, to escape death? Yet in all his vast relief he found space for a little regret that Seldon had been defeated. Immediately after, Gale accompanied Seldon to his office at the university. It was not a large office, but it was spy-proof, and quite undetectably so. It was here that Seldon confided in Gale. He had been preparing to leave for 2 years. He had, in fact, maneuvered the Exile. On Terminus, he reasoned, he would have Imperial support without ever rousing fears that he would endanger Imperial safety. Gale did not understand. Seldon had, after all, aroused those fears only to force exile. Seldon explained. It was done, he said, to ensure passage of the 20,000 families on the project who would perhaps not have traveled to the end of the galaxy on their own. Why, Gale wanted to know, should they be forced there? "It is enough for the moment," Seldon said, "that you know that a scientific refuge will be established on Terminus, and another will be established at the other end of the galaxy." And he smiled. "As for the rest," he said, "I will die soon, and after I die there will be successors, perhaps even yourself. And those successors will be able to apply the final touch in the scheme, and instigate the revolt of the planet Anacreon at the right time and in the right moment." Gale was puzzled. "I do not understand," he said. And Seldon replied, "You will." Terminus, from an entry in the Encyclopedia Galactica. Located on the very fringe of the galaxy, an only planet of an isolated sun, poor in resources and negligible in economic value, Terminus was never settled in the centuries after its discovery until the landing of the encyclopedists. The location was an odd one for the role it was called upon to play in galactic history, yet it was inevitable that as a new generation grew, Terminus would become something more than an appendage of the psychohistorians of Trantor. Louis Perrin was busily engaged at his desk in the one well-lit corner of the room. Work had to be coordinated, effort had to be organized, threads had to be woven into patterns. 50 years had passed. 50 years they'd been given to establish themselves and set up Encyclopedia Foundation number 1 into a smoothly working unit. It had been done. 5 more years would see the publication of the first volume of the most monumental work the galaxy had ever conceived, and then at 10-year intervals, regularly, like clockwork, volume after volume. Perrin stirred uneasily at the sound of the door buzzer. He shoved the door release and saw the door open. The broad figure of Salvor Hardin, mayor of Terminus, entered. Perrin did not look up. Hardin smiled to himself. He was in a hurry, but he knew Perrin all too well, and buried himself in the chair on the other side of the desk and waited. Perrin sighed. "I hope you're not going to bother me with city affairs," he said. "Take care of that yourself, please. The encyclopedia takes up all my time." Hardin asked if he'd heard the news, received on the Terminus City ultrawave set just 2 hours ago. The royal governor of the prefect of Anacreon had assumed the title of king. Perrin did not understand its significance. "It means," said Hardin, "that we're cut off from the inner regions of the empire." He elaborated. Anacreon stood square across what had been Terminus's last remaining trade route to Santana, and to Trantor, and Vega itself. Trade was now dependent upon the grace of the king of Anacreon. Hardin, as mayor of the city whose prosperity depended on uninterrupted commerce with the galaxy, wanted Pirenne to call an emergency meeting of the Foundation's Board of Trustees. But Pirenne would have none of it. The Foundation, after all, was a state-supported scientific institution. Interference in local politics was unheard of. "Local politics," said Hardin. "By the Emperor's left toe, Pirenne. This is a matter of life and death. The planet Terminus cannot support a mechanized civilization. It lacks metals. What do you think will happen to the encyclopedia if this whatchamacallem king of Anacreon clamps down on us?" Pirenne reminded him firmly that Terminus was part of the Emperor's domain, and the Empire, he staunchly believed, could protect its own. But the Empire, Hardin pointed out, had done nothing to prevent the Anacreonian situation, and at least 20 of the outermost prefects of the galaxy, the entire periphery for that matter, had begun to steer things their own way. "I feel damned uncertain," said Hardin, "of the Empire and its ability to protect us." Pirenne demanded that Hardin do something about his paper, the Terminus City Journal. "For weeks now," he complained, "it has been recommending that the 50th anniversary of the Foundation be made the occasion for public holidays and quite inappropriate celebrations." The mayor answered that the paper was not his. But, he added, the city charter guarantees a certain minor matter known as freedom of the press. "It may," Pirenne admitted, "but the Board of Trustees does not. I am the Emperor's representative on Terminus, Hardin, and have full power in this respect." Hardin's reply was succinct. "In connection with your status as Emperor's representative," he said, I have news for you. A special envoy will be sent to us from Anacreon in 2 weeks." Pirenne pondered this. He asked the purpose of the envoy's visit. "I give you one guess," said Hardin, and he left, quite unceremoniously. Anselm Hort Roderick, Hort itself signifying noble blood, sub-prefect of Pluema, and envoy extraordinary of His Highness of Anacreon, plus a half-dozen other titles, was met by Salvor Hardin at the spaceport with all the imposing ritual of a state occasion. With a tight smile and a low bow, the sub-prefect had flipped his blaster from its holster and presented it to Hardin butt first. Hardin returned the compliment with a blaster specifically borrowed for the occasion. Friendship and goodwill were thus established, and if Hardin noticed the barest bulge at Hort Roderick's shoulder, he prudently said nothing. The diplomatic small talk that ensued was banal, but it was apparent to Hardin that he was being pumped for information on the physical and political status of Terminus. If Hardin found himself bored by that afternoon and the evening that followed, he had at least the satisfaction of realizing that Pirenne and Hort Roderick, having met with loud and mutual protestations of esteem and regard, were detesting each other's company a good deal more. The dinner that evening was much the mirror of the events of that afternoon, for Hort Roderick monopolized the conversation by describing, in minute technical detail and with incredible zest, his own exploits as battalion head during the recent war between Anacreon and the neighboring newly proclaimed kingdom of Smyrno. The last bit of triumphant description of mangled spaceships came when Hort Roderick accompanied Pirenne and Hardin onto the balcony and relaxed in the warm air of the summer evening. Hort Roderick puffed on a long cigar of vegan tobacco that Hardin had offered him. "There's been a certain change in the situation out here in the periphery," he said, "and the status of your planet has become a trifle uncertain. It would be very convenient if we came to an understanding as to how the matter stands." Pirenne scowled. He asked His Eminence if he was correct in understanding that his mission was one of clarification. Hort Roderick nodded. With that, Pirenne stated emphatically that the situation with respect to the Encyclopedia Foundation was what it had always been, a state-supported scientific institution that was part of the personal domain of His August Majesty the Emperor. Hort Roderick seemed unimpressed. He blew smoke rings. "That's a nice theory, Dr. Pirenne," he said, "but how do you stand with respect to Smyrna? You're not 50 parsecs from Smyrna's capital, you know. And what about Konam and Darabao?" Pirenne answered that Terminus had nothing to do with those kingdoms. It was a scientific institution. "Science be damned," said Hort Roderick. "What the devil has that to do with the fact that Terminus is liable to be taken over by Smyrna at any time? We've just finished a war with Smyrna, and she still holds 2 stellar systems that are ours. Terminus occupies an extremely strategic spot between the 2 nations." Harden wearily broke in and asked His Eminence just what his proposition was. The sub-prefect was quite ready to stop fencing in favor of more direct statements. "It seems perfectly obvious," he said, "that since Terminus cannot defend itself, Anacreon must take over the job." Hort Roderick insisted his kingdom had no desire to interfere with internal administration, but believed it would be best for all concerned to have Anacreon establish a military base upon Terminus. And, of course, he said, there would be the matter of supporting the protecting forces. Harden's chair came down on all 4s, and his elbows went forward on his knees. Terminus was to be a protectorate, and to pay tribute. "Not tribute," said Hort Roderick. "Taxes. We're protecting you, you pay for it." Pirenne banged his hand on the chair with sudden violence. Expressing disdain for the petty wars and local politics of Anacreon and Smyrna, he reminded the sub-prefect that the Foundation was a tax-free, state-supported institution. "State-supported," said Hort Roderick, "but we are the state, and we are not supporting." Now Harden broke in to ask His Eminence how he would take those so-called taxes. The answer was gold, or chromium, or vanadium. Harden laughed and reminded Hort Roderick that Terminus was a planet practically without metals. Pirenne took it one step further. Terminus was not a planet, but a scientific foundation preparing a great encyclopedia. "Encyclopedias don't win wars," said Hort Roderick. He assessed the situation and next suggested that such a completely unproductive and practically unoccupied world might pay with land. Pirenne's reaction was distress. "There's no necessity of looking so alarmed, Dr. Pirenne," said Hort Roderick. "There's plenty for all of us. Titles can be conferred and estates granted. You understand me, I think." And then Harden asked, ingenuously, could Anacreon supply Terminus with adequate quantities of plutonium for her nuclear power plants? There was a gasp from Pirenne and then dead silence. After a few minutes, Hort Roderick spoke. "You have nuclear power?" he asked. "Certainly," replied Harden, pointing out that nuclear power was, after all, 50,000 years old. His Eminence excused himself. He suggested they pursue the subject on the following day. Pirenne looked after him, then whirled on Harden, exasperated that he had blown off his mouth about a nuclear power plant, just the sort of thing that could make Terminus a military target. Harden grinned. "Yes," he said, "a military target to be stayed away from." He explained. He had brought the subject up to confirm his strong suspicion that Anacreon no longer had a nuclear power economy. If they had, Hort Roderick would undoubtedly have realized that plutonium, except in ancient tradition, was not used in power plants. Therefore, it followed that the rest of the periphery no longer had nuclear power either. Certainly Smyrna hadn't, or Anacreon would not have won most of the battles in their recent war. Pirenne left in a fiendish humor, and Harden smiled gently. He looked up at the outstretched galaxy. "Back to oil and coal, are they?" he murmured, and what the rest of his thoughts were he kept to himself. When Harden had denied owning the journal, he was perhaps technically correct, but no more. Harden had been the leading spirit in the drive to incorporate Terminus into an autonomous municipality. He had been elected its first mayor. So it was not surprising that, though not a single share of journal stock was in his name, some 60% was controlled by him in more devious fashions. There were ways. Consequently, when Hardin began suggesting to Pirenne that he be allowed to attend meetings of the Board of Trustees, it was not quite coincidence that the journal began a similar campaign, and eventually Pirenne capitulated with ill grace.